Hi class. So the idea of this video is to introduce you to lesson 6, chapter 6, lesson 6. We are at risk assessment part 3, and in this lesson we are going to address threat analysis. So as usual, the way that I'd like to introduce you to this lesson is by looking at the lesson activities, okay? Which, as you know, has a description and introduction of what we are going to do, right? Also, I gotta remind you, and I will actually go back to it, talk a little bit more about this at the end of this video. But one thing that I really want to highlight here is the importance of going through the additional extra resources that you'll find at the end of this activities page. Okay, now even more so, the considering these two links here, right? So the Venn diagram and adding probabilities, and also the compound probability of independent events, both from the Khan Academy. Okay, it's very, very important that you watch these videos, because they well, I am expecting that you've already taken IST 230, which is discrete mathematics. So the idea is to just review what probability is, mathematically speaking, what probability is, and what conditional probability is. So these two types of probabilities, generally speaking, probability, and even more specific, conditional probability, it's going to be very, very important to have a thorough understanding of what we are going to address in this lesson. Okay? Now, okay. So as usual, let's take a look at our module introduction. So in this module, we're gonna basically consider the threat part of security risk, right? You gotta remember that risk, the computation of risk, is actually considering threat and the vulnerability, the threat and the vulnerability. In here, we are going to focus on the threat part. So, where does threat come into play? Well, there are actually two places, okay? The first place in the construction of scenarios. So you got to recall that a scenario is basically the pairing of the cause or event, if you prefer, and consequence or outcome. The event is the threat in the descriptive sense, and here the event is the action of the person we label as the threat, obviously, right? Which for all intents and purposes is the application of a capability or resource against a target, right? In fact, and obviously this is something that we've discussed, we talked about many times during this course. In fact, it would be totally acceptable to decompose the event itself into two subfactors, such as tactic and target, right? So basically, we could consider that an event is the combination of the target and a tactic being the approach that the attacker is going to use in order to target that specific target. In truth, you can distill events as far down as you like, but think of each partitioning of the set of possible scenarios as yet another scoop of dirt you are digging to create the hole you must ultimately jump into, right? Again, going back to what we discussed in our previous lesson, the list of scenarios will depend on the list of events, right? And the list of events can be actually very, very long. What we're talking about in this module is not the threat part of the scenario, okay? Not the threat part of the scenario, but the threat part of the probability of cause. So what this means here is the threat part of the scenario is something that we already addressed in our previous lesson, right? Again, a scenario is the combination of an event and an outcome, right? So as far as building the list of scenarios, that's something that we already addressed. Now we're going to address the threat part, specifically considering the probability of that event, the probability of that threat, okay? Or what we can also call the probability of cause. That is, this week we are focused on answering, not this week, right? But when we come back from spring break. So when we come back from spring break, we'll be focusing on answering the part of the question, how likely is it? So we got to remember, that in risk management, there are 9 critical questions that we must answer. We could also include those other 3 questions, that is treating, associated with treating the risks, right? But the 9 questions are the most important ones when it comes to risk assessment. Now, so what we're basically trying to do here is to answer the how likely is it to happen question, okay? Now, we got to recall from last module that the probability of a scenario is the probability of this pair, right? Event and outcome. But the probability of event and outcome is actually the probability of an event times the probability of the outcome, of an outcome given a specific event. Yes, this is a lot of math notation, and that's why I told you very early in this video that you do need to recap what probability is, how to compute probability, and specifically what conditional probability is. But if you're going to be a risk person, you really ought to get used to it, since the philosophical underpinnings of risk management is grounded in probability theory. What you need to understand here is that risk, and again, another thing that we talked about many times, risk management is not a very objective matter, right? It's actually very subjective. What we try to do here is to use some approaches, to use some methodologies and methods to bring some objectiveness into such a subjective analysis, right? So what that means is nothing is certain. We cannot actually identify, basically say, hey, this is 100% a threat, right? We never know. What we can try to do is to determine the probability of an event or the probability of a threat achieving its success, so that we can then combine that with the impact, right, of that threat in case the threat actually achieves its goal, right? So the first part of the right-hand side of the equation is the probability of an event, which is also known as the threat term, right? The second part is the probability of the outcome given that specific event. That is known as the vulnerability term, okay? Now, this week, or in this lesson, we are focusing on the threat term. We're not focusing on the vulnerability term yet, okay? Conveniently, note that the probability of an event and the probability of an outcome given an event. Making sense of probability of event requires an understanding of simple probability theory, okay? So again, for now, we're focusing on the probability of event, not the probability of a vulnerability. We're focusing on the threat term, not on the vulnerability term, right? That means that for now, we're focusing on understanding simple probability theory, okay? Which is basically, if we think of an example, we could consider, hey, if I have a stack of cards, what is the probability of me drawing kings of hearts, right? Which is different from a conditional probability. A conditional probability means a similar example could be, well, what is the probability of me drawing a king of hearts if I already drew two other cards that were kings in a previous drawing, right? So in conditional probability, I have a condition. So the situation may change. But again, for now, we're going to focus on simple probability theory. Whereas the probability of an outcome given an event requires an understanding of conditional probability. Hence, this week's background material consists of a bunch of video lectures that review the basics of probability theory. You must learn how to think about probabilities to be able to make sense of the probability of an event. After you watch and digest the content of these videos, as I highlighted already, okay, you'll be asked to work on 10 probability problems aimed at demonstrating to me that you grasp the absolute bare minimum of the subject being probability, okay? So for now, we need, so far, what I want you to understand is we are focusing on threat analysis, right? We're not focusing on vulnerability analysis. We're focusing on the probability of an event, measuring the probability of an event, okay? Measuring, answering the how likely is it to happen question, okay? But again, still focusing on the simple probability computation, not conditional probability. For me, this is good enough, though in truth, you need to be nearly a probability expert to be a high-performance risk person. Now again, this is considering that you want to be a risk person, not specifically a information security risk analyst, okay? Or not a vulnerability analyst. If you are a vulnerability analyst or a threat analyst, specifically in the information security context, then you do not need to be a probability expert, okay? Once you get past the mathematical part of probability, then it is time to talk about the nature of the probability of the event. What that is what drives the probability of an event? To answer this question begs for an understanding of what the probability of an event is. So you can think about the probability of an event as being the probability of cause of harm occurring. Well, which leads us to the question, what is this cause? It is an assault by an individual we label as a threat. Whether or not this cause occurs really depends on what the threat decides to do. And what drives such a decision? It depends on whether the adversary perceives that he has an opportunity consistent with his or her intentions and innovations for which he thinks or she thinks that he or she has the capability to act on. So several criteria can drive the adversary decision process, right? For example, a question that the adversary might ask himself or herself is the perceived probability of success greater than or equal to the minimum acceptable probability of success? Is the perceived gain from success greater or equal to the minimum acceptable gain? Is the perceived loss from failure less than or equal to the maximum tolerable loss? So basically what we're addressing here is, okay, look, we want to determine to compute whether to compute the probability of an event, right? And the probability of an event is basically associated with the probability of a threat. Now, is that threat actually going to try to execute the attack? That's what we're trying to identify here, right? And as you can see, this is very subjective because, well, we need to, if there is a threat, that does not mean that the actor, the threat actor, is actually going to try to deploy an attack, for example, right? It will depend on a number of facts or reasons. So there is also subjective, but also a human factor that plays in here, which is what is actually what are the considerations that are being made by that attacker or by the threat actor in order to actually try to deploy that attack. Okay, so these are questions that the attacker will ask him or herself. So the attacker will basically, in summary, the attacker will basically try to determine if it is worth it to perform that attack. Okay, so these are the questions that must be answered. So let's examine these questions. Suppose an adversary come upon a potential opportunity worth an adversary's time and consideration. Okay, so that attacker is still, the adversary is still considering performing the attack. Whether this potential opportunity is truly a real opportunity, right, depends on whether the adversary can muster up the skills, knowledge, resources, and capabilities necessary to bring his perceived probability of success up high enough to satisfy his appetite or aversion for risk. Now, but just because his chances of succeeding are good does not mean that the potential opportunity is a real opportunity. For instance, you can be highly successful at causing a person to suffer a paper cut, but what good is that if your goal is to exact death and destruction in a community? Thus, a real opportunity not only requires a high probability of success, but also an appreciable gain from success, right? So if we think of a more technical example, let's say that an attacker sees the opportunity to attack, to exploit a server. Now, that is a server that is not going to bring any gain, or the gain is not high enough when the attacker considers the risks against him or her, right? So for example, if an attacker attacks a specific server, a company's server, but this server is not going to cause a big damage when it goes down, the company will continue to run. The impact is going to be very low. So what is the attacker going to gain in response to that attack? Almost nothing. But also, what is the possible loss? The attacker may be flagged, which means that that company, the target, might detect where the attack comes from, might try to trace it back to him, which means that some legal response may occur. I mean, the trade-off between gain and loss is not positive, it's actually negative, which means that in this situation, the attacker should not perform that attack, right? So it's not only a matter of opportunity, it's also a matter of the gain compared to the possible loss. Okay? But what about this last criterion? Perceived loss from failure. Think of the guy working for the mob. He might be assigned a job whose chances of success are low and the gain from success is equally low. But suppose that in case he failed at it, the consequences might be him having to go to the mattresses, right? The potential loss might be so great to make the bad guy say, well, here goes nothing, right? In the end, the bottom line is that what guides an adversary's decision to attack is, well, complicated. I didn't even start to mention that what the defender does to protect an asset also has the effect of influencing the probability of attack, especially if the adversary is of the type that surveils potential targets prior to the attack. So what I'm trying to say here is I'm not even considering that the defender, right, or the target might also put some defenses in place, which is going to make my life a lot harder. Imagine that you're told of a really bad threat that was highly likely. You decide to investigate thousands of Benjamins to mitigate the vulnerability, only to find that by doing so, you provide a disincentive for the bad guy to make an attempt. In this sense, your investment in vulnerability reduction had more bang for the buck than intended. Double risk reduction. To better understand the nature of adversary decision processes, I provided 2 papers I wanted you to skim through. Read the parts that are interesting, glance over the rest. At the end of this page here, at the additional resources, you'll find these 2 papers. The idea is to develop a good appreciation for the nature of adversary decision process. More will come on this topic later if you choose to pursue it as your elective content. Okay? Now, how does adversary decision tie into the probability of an event? Well, it's actually pretty simple. We do not know what the adversary is really thinking. Hence, we are uncertain about it. And it just so happens that probability is the language of uncertainty, right? Our beliefs about what the adversary might do in the future can be encoded by a probability distribution across all probabilities in whatever complete, finite, and non-overlapping set of possibilities we define. Thus, we can develop a mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive set of scenarios, view them from the adversary's point of view, and use our understanding to establish a relative ordering of the scenarios based on their probability of them being the one that actually happens. So again, although this is very subjective, it's all very subjective, what we're trying to do so far is to bring some objective methodologies. So in our previous lesson, we saw how we can assemble the scenarios, and during the scenario assembling, we need to identify the events, right? So not only the list of scenarios, but in order to build the list of scenarios, we need to build the list of events. And by building the list of events, that's the initial phase. Now that we have that list of events, we have to identify the probability, to establish the probability for each of those events. But again, this is very, very subjective. So we can use our experience, we can use data such as history data, we can use statistics in order to identify those probabilities, and then redefine our list in, let's say, in a sequence, right, based on severity. So that's the whole point here. Now, in a not too distant future, you have practice doing this in your risk analysis project work, okay? So for now, work on the stuff of this module to build a stronger appreciation for the threat part of the probability equation, okay? Now, one thing that I want to say is, I want you to remember that on Monday, March 4th at 8 a.m., we're going to have our meeting you're going to meet your group peers so that you can start interacting, you can start discussing about the group project. Okay, so remember that this is an edge project. It's a project with students from another institution. These students, they are specifically this course, they are studying risk in the industrial environment. So just be aware that basically this is what you are going to help them with. Basically, they are going to visit a factory, okay, and they will report to you what they see in that factory, and based on that, you guys are going to help them identify the risks according to what they were able to explain to you, what they were able to see, what they were able to identify. So again, observe that specifically this module here, threat analysis, and the next module, vulnerability analysis, are going to be critical for your group project. Okay, guys? So thank you very much, and I'll see you on Monday at 8 a.m. Please do not forget about our meeting. Thank you.